Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining. My name is Francesca, and we'll be starting shortly. Thank you all for joining. And yeah, sit tight, and we'll be starting soon.
I got something ready to read. Everyone understands stuck in traffic. How many registrants are there?
I am not sure.
You're letting people in? Oh, there she is. Let her in.
Well, thank you all for joining us. As I said, I welcome everybody. My name is Francesca. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am a grad global impact intern at the International House here in NU Chicago. The mission of International House is to enable students and scholars from around the world to live and learn together in a diverse community that builds lifelong qualities of leadership, respect, and friendship. Founded in 1932 by John D. Rockefeller Jr., International House of Chicago is today one of 20 members of the International House's worldwide network. In addition to supporting the graduate student community through our Graduate Commons program, International House also serves the greater Chicago community as a cultural and intellectual center for a wide array of programs. Close to 100 public programs are held each year at the International House through the Global Voices Performing Arts and Lecture Series. And as we begin autumn quarter, we'll be providing virtual, in-person, and hybrid programming. You can learn more about the different types of events at ihouse.uchicago.edu. The Global Voices Performing Arts and Lecture Series includes outreach programs with Chicago area, books including An Indigenous People's History of the United States, a recipient of the 2015 American Book Award. And don't forget, you can purchase her new book, Not A Nation of Immigrants, Settler Colonialism, White Supremacy, and a History of Erasure and Exclusion, now from Seminary Co-op Bookstores. Harsha Walia is the award-winning author of Undoing Border imperialism, and most recently, border and rural. Trained in law, she is a community organizer and campaigner in migrant justice, feminist and anti-capitalist, abolitionist, and anti-imperialist movements. Following tonight's presentation, there will be an opportunity for questions, so please submit those via the Q&A function. Now, please welcome Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz and Harsha Walia.
Hi, thank you so much for hosting us. Hello, Roxanne. I'm so thrilled.
Harsha.
Hello. Hello.
So good to see you.
You too. It is so good to see you. Thank you so much for writing this brilliant book and all of your amazing work. I'm just turning off Wi-Fi on my phone because my phone is draining Wi-Fi. Hello. I'm so thrilled to be in conversation with you. And for anyone who hasn't read Roxanne's book or picked it up, please do so. This book is incredible. All of Roxanne's work is incredible. And I have learned such a tremendous amount from your work, Roxanne. It informs my work. It really is the basis of my work. So I'm so excited to be in conversation and to ask you some questions and for all of us to hear from your brilliance. And really, you know, this work builds on so much of your other work. And if I may, the first question that I wanted to ask you, and of course, please feel free to talk about anything else you want as well, is that, you know, one of the things that you talk about in your book is how the Nation of Immigrants kind of refrain, as a liberal refrain, as well as a conservative frame, really is a revisionist origin story. And one of the things that I found really compelling about this book is your detailing of this revisionist history and the purposes that it serves. And I'm wondering if you could walk us through that revisionist history and what purpose it serves when we hear the refrain of, you know, A Nation of Immigrants.
A very, very central question to this book. I was wondering, is that term used in Canada, Nation of Immigrants as well, or is it only the United States?
I'd say it's probably more prominent in the United States. It is used in Canada, and in the Canadian context, perhaps a corollary to that is also the multiculturalism, the myth of multiculturalism,
Right.
which is very similar. And, you know, the kind of two founding nations of Canada, or in Canada being England and France. So it's similar, but it seems like the US has its unique revisionist history there. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's a deeply US mythology. And it is, you know, it was in post World War II. The United States had been an exclusionary, completely exclusionary. Every immigration law is exclusion. The first one was exclusion of Chinese. That was extended in another law excluding all Asians from, I don't know, from the Arab world to the Philippines and everything in between. And then exclusion of the rest of the world except for Western Europe in 1923. And that still held in the post-war period. But very clearly, things were changing. There's a genocide convention, there's human rights coming out of the international order, the United Nations is established, and the Soviet Union is considered the main competitor and enemy. And the Soviet Union is, people in the Soviet Union are very well aware of the racism and genocide in the United States and begin using it in the Cold War, you know, as propaganda in the 1950s. I mean, it really wasn't propaganda, it was true. You know, they weren't making it up. So for the United States to have a status that, you know, claiming to be the leader in the world and the New World Order, they had to do some camouflaging, at least, to their practices. So immigration was really the softest thing they could do, given Jim Crow and Black people being brutalized in the South with the burgeoning civil rights movement. Native people locked down in reservations and under termination, a law of termination to do away completely with the land bases. It was a horrible time, time of the Red Scare and the McCarthyism and paranoia, much like today. We're back in the 50s. So it was John F. Kennedy himself, the child of very wealthy immigrants, but nevertheless Irish immigrants and Catholic. As a senator in 1958, he actually invented this term, or his aides did, someone did, under his name, A Nation of Immigrants. And he published a book, which is still a bestseller. It's been in hundreds, thousands, probably thousands of editions and printings. It's a slim book. If you go to Amazon, you can find it 3 or 4 pages of different editions with different introductions and conclusions. And in that, I think he had his own personal ambition. He was already thinking about running for president, or his father was ready to bankroll him to run for president in 1960. But this was in 1958. And it's mainly about the Irish immigration, defending it, making the United States as welcoming. Of course, they did not at all welcome the 2 million starving Irish refugees in the 1840s. They were treated very badly. And creating a mythology based on nothing. It was right during, in fact, the Operation Wetback. That was its official name in Congress, Operation Wetback, the slur for Mexicans, Mexican migrants. It was right in the middle of this. Right at that time, about 1 million people were being deported, and it was being televised. It was a big show to show the US public they were cracking down on illegal immigration. And he was in Senate, when they passed the law. So he was oblivious to all of this. He was basically creating a myth. It's an interesting study of how a myth is created. It's probably the most clear cut. When I first thought of writing this book back in 2007, I think it was 2005 or sometime, I wasn't thinking of writing a book, but I wrote a rant. I call it a rant. We used to call them blogs. It was a blog for Monthly Review. Stop calling this A Nation of Immigrants. I had no idea about this book or about Kennedy or where it came from. I thought it had just always existed, as a US myth. I hadn't looked into it. And so this thing kind of went viral. It really touched a nerve, especially among the activists and the left, that, because they know how immigrants are treated and the exclusion. So that was, and I kept repeating that and talking about it. And then after I published an Indigenous Peoples' History of the United States, I have one little paragraph condemning the Nation of Immigrants mythology. One paragraph in the book, still not knowing where it came from, or anything about Kennedy's role. And my editor asked me if I could take that and do a book, do a book on it. And so I said, yeah, well, I might as well, I'm kind of obsessed with it. And that's when I started doing the research. This was a few years ago. This book has been, gestating for a while. I actually wrote it last year, but it had been gestating. And I was really surprised that it had been created so recently. And so that's That's really the origin story of the Nation of Immigrants and my discovery of it.
Thank you for that, Roxanne. And yeah, reading that in your book struck me as well, because I don't know that many of us know that trajectory. And thank you for digging that up. And I don't know if you remember this, Roxanne, actually, but prior to 2007, to your piece that went viral because it was brilliant, as all your work is, you had written a lengthy email that was very similar to your blog post on what was then the Colors of Resistance email list. That struck a chord with me, and I think many others as well. So I feel like it's been gestating for longer in you, because that is something that I was profoundly struck by as someone who was organizing and working in migrant justice movements and thinking about the relationship between immigration and settler colonialism. And you had written this email on this email distribution list around work that was happening across the so-called US and Canada. And so I think that would have probably been a few years prior to that as well. So thank you for doing this work for so long, and even longer than that, I know. And I don't know if you remember that, but I don't
even remember that.
Yeah,
I think the other part of my raving, besides it just simply not being true, is I think it's used, this myth is used as a way of covering up settler colonialism. That this then is backdated to Alexander Hamilton, for instance, that has been played out in this musical, Alexander Hamilton, as an immigrant, whereas he was a settler. There were no immigrants up to the 1840s and the Irish famine refugees. They weren't really immigrants, they were really refugees. They were settlers that came to take land and take authority and expand across the continent. And the laughable thing is that he came from the Caribbean, but he came from the British Caribbean, and the United States was still British. So he moved from one colony, British colony, to another. That would be like today, someone from where I come from, Oklahoma, coming as I did to California to go to school. He went to go to school at Columbia University. It's like moving from one place to the other within the same nation state, the British nation. So that's so annoying, and among other things about the Hamilton. It was a reawakening. It's actually the first, I think, the first big production that talk about going viral, to, just absolutely captivating practically everyone in the country, from 12-year-old to 100, that embodies the Nation of Immigrants. The renewal process of while children are being separated and turned back, refugees fleeing from violence in Central America, where the United States in the 1980s destroyed those countries with war, covert and overt, and even Honduras in 2009, a coup that overthrew a slightly progressive presidential president, overthrew the government. So this is, such hypocrisy that and unfortunately, it's mostly liberals who embrace the Nation of Immigrants. Conservatives, especially Trumpist conservatives, if you can call them conservatives, I call them fascists, but they don't want anyone to come, except Europeans, Western Europeans.
Roxanne, in that vein, one of the really important things and the work that your book does is to, in addition to kind of unearthing the origin story of the Nation of Immigrants, is also your book does a fantastic job of really meticulously detailing how that myth, as you just have been speaking to, erases and evades and obscures the reality of settler colonialism, of global imperialism. You detail, as you called it, the open wound that is still the border, in your words, as a result of conquest and also of enslavement. And I'm wondering if you could spend a little bit of time, because as you note, this is a myth that's largely propagated by liberals. The United States is currently under what some would believe to be a liberal administration. The Democratic Party, the centrist Democratic Party, the neoliberal liberal Democratic Party in the tradition of Biden, Clinton, and Obama have also used and perpetuated and propagated this myth of the Nation of Immigrants in such a way that it continues to, mainstream the movement, erase against settler colonialism, imperialism, and anti-Black violence. And I'm wondering if you could speak to two things. One is why the myth requires the sanitization of that violence, what the impacts of that sanitization is, and particularly for those of us who are organizing and on the ground or thinking or writing about this, what are the things that we have to be thinking about, even in our work, ways in which we might be propagating this myth, right, intentionally or unintentionally. That's a few questions in there. But I'm hoping you can cover that.
Yeah, I feel very conflicted myself, and I tried to be careful in the book not to I don't know, to not give the impression that that what people who are working on protecting and supporting immigrants like yourself, no one is illegal. In Canada, we don't have anything quite as fantastic as that you helped build. But we do have a number of organizations and alliances, and they work tirelessly and for nothing. Very hard work on the border, often very dangerous work, because there are these, these armed white nationalists who go and, actually threaten immigrants and threaten those who are helping them. People have been arrested and sent to jail simply for putting water out in the desert so that migrants don't die. And of course, it's so heavily policed. So I don't want to ever discourage or take away from that work, because it's important. And I do think that tragically it is sustained in some ways with an idealism about that, of propagating a Nation of Immigrants mythology as a way of making US American citizens more receptive. They're better angels, as they like to say. I'm not sure there are better angels in the US. I'm not sure there's that much of a dichotomy. And it's so deep, but I do hope that in those organizations, and I know that no one is illegal, and I certainly witnessed it when you invited me to speak in Vancouver at a conference. It just blew my mind. The immigrants and the Native people together there. Nothing like that has really happened in the United States. There certainly is in Arizona that the Tohono people who are right on the border actually straddle the border. It's a terrible inconvenience for them, because they have ceremonies on both sides and they have to go through, way around just to get sometimes to get to their corn patch on the other side, to tend their gardens, or get their water supply or whatever. But they also put water out. They have a certain amount, they have a certain amount of sovereignty, where if migrants do end up in the U.S. side reservation, there are lots of Tohono O'odham people who help them, because of the trust status of the federal trust status of the colonial institution in the United States that controls Native people. There's only so much the tribal council can do, the governing, because it is really under the Bureau of Indian Affairs. One could hope that under Deb Haaland as Secretary of Interior, a Native woman herself, Laguna Pueblo, that she will take note of this, and how the control that doesn't allow as much of a protection that the Tohono O'odham could, and other Native people all along the border, are Native people on both sides. That border just cut through, just like the Canadian-US border cuts through Native nations and separates them from each other. So that's really the problem in confronting that nation of immigrants. I think it would be more effective if there could be education within the organization, like you have in Canada, of bringing Native people and actual migrants and immigrants and their representatives together to discuss these things and to formulate an analysis that's true and accurate historically. Because I think the truth really works better than mythology, than not mythology so much as telling a story that is untrue, but maybe feels better in the short term, but in the long term is not very effective for creating change.
Thank you for that. I wanted to ask you maybe a few more questions before we turn it over to Q&A that's going to be moderated. One of the things that you write about and have been so consistent in all of your work, all of your amazing work around, and in this book that you kind of say is the elephant in the room, which is, how to understand immigration in relationship to conquest and imperialism. And of course, in the US context, you're writing here about the role of US military invasion and US imperialism and its relationship to immigration. And that is, of course, part of the Nation of Immigrants myth, right? That erasure. I'm wondering if you can speak a bit more to that and the centrality of understanding the relationship between imperialism and immigration, because of course, oftentimes they're seen as separated issues, right? One is seen kind of in the global / foreign policy scope. The other is seen as the local kind of domestic policy realm, if you will, in literature and scholarly work, in movement work. And you do such important work, as do other scholars as well, and movement organizers around that bridge. But you really center that. And I'm wondering if you can speak a bit more to, as you already have, but speak a bit more to that relationship and addressing that elephant in the room, as you call it.
Yeah, when I first began working on this book, I had the great good luck of a book being published called Nothing Ever Dies. It's a nonfiction book by the Pulitzer Prize winning famous writer Viet Thanh Nguyen, who wrote The Surrounded and The Committed, the great novels. Fewer people know about the nonfiction book, and it's a hard book to read, the truth in that book. But it was only when I read, and I was totally convinced by his argument that practically all US immigration is based on US imperialism and wars that ruin people's countries. There are quite a few books out by mostly South Asian, more recent immigrants since 1964 is when it's opening up to, the rest of the world, Africa and Asia, and the Caribbean for immigration, and their offspring, and of course one newer ones coming in. That we are here because you were there. That's the kind of, it's become almost a chant in my mind of looking at each case. And what Viet Nguyen does is really show, in the case of Southeast Asia, that none of these, the Cambodians, the Laotians, the Vietnamese, the so-called boat people live in, refugee camps. They clearly were not immigrants. They're refugees. We've seen the helicopters on the roof, the Saigon, fleeing Saigon. These are non-immigrants, applying for visas and so forth. We see it being played out now with Afghanis, and we're going to call, they're already, you see in the press and you see in the objections to their coming here as being immigrants. And in no way, the United States has made their country unlivable, really unlivable. Why is it within 2 weeks of the US leaving, the World Food Program announces that over 1 million Afghani children are in stages of starvation? That just didn't happen overnight, That was happening the whole time that supposedly the US was building, the nation building. So they were building basically a comprador class, as Africans call it, a class that a small class of elites that will serve the United States. That's how colonialism works. And that's what they were building. And that does not help 99.9% of the people in those countries. So in almost every case, you see more and more African immigrants really starting big with Somalia. You trace it exactly to the war making in those countries. And not to talk, to speak of the corporate exploitation and extraction and other things that make countries unlivable, that are linked with, or that are part of imperialism, the sort of non-military part of imperialism, the corporations. So I really recommend reading Viet Nguyen's Nothing Ever Dies, because he does expand it as a generality of all immigration to the United States, if you really look at each case. And in the book, I kept looking because he made me aware of it. And sure enough, it definitely is almost none of these people, from the very beginning of the Irish famine refugees should be considered immigrants. They should be, but the United States has a quota on refugees that is so low. It's lower than any other country. Within the last 20 years of warfare in Afghanistan, there have been millions of refugees that have fled the country. 2 million to Pakistan, 1.5 million to Iran. Germany took 160,000. The United States took 30,000, only 30,000 Afghan refugees from those wars in the last 20 years. So it's a very stingy, it's the stingiest refugee regime in the world. The Lebanese, part of their crashing now has to do with the overload of war refugees from Iraq, from Syria, from Yemen that, you know, come in, and of course the Palestinians have been there for, you know, since 1948. So we've ruined that country inadvertently by making war, ruined countries that aren't occupied, like Lebanon, because they, you know, they're overburdened with refugees that the US creates.
Thank you, Roxanne. I'm going to ask one last question and then turn it over for some Q&A moderation. If I may, Roxanne, you know, again, this book is just, it's so well researched, it's meticulous, and it provides such a prescient analysis, right, through the lens of history into this current moment. And I'm wondering if you could share with us some thoughts. Oh, I think you're screen sharing. Share with us, you know, given what you are, oh, do you wanna have that up there, or did you wanna stop that, Roxanne?
I don't know what happened.
Oh, okay. I think it's share screen at the bottom. You might just wanna hit stop share if you'd like.
I don't have any bottom anymore.
Oh, okay. I don't know that I can. Well, maybe someone can pop on and stop the screen sharing on here. But I'll ask you the question if it's not too distracting for you, which is that, you know, so you have been detailing, or you detail in this book, the history of white nationalism, the rise of fascism. You detail the Yellow Peril. These are, of course, all, you know, history repeating themselves, right? These moments of history repeating themselves, and, you know, important reminders here in your book about how the rise, thank you, about how the rise of fascism and white nationalism is, you know, it's baked into the foundation of the United States, which your book makes clear and lays plain that this is not about a current moment. This is not about Trump, that this is, you know, the escalation of the foundation of the settler state, of the slaveholding state, of the expansionist state. And so I'm wondering, in this moment, based on the ways in which you have so meticulously, again, detailed these historical trajectories, if you can lay out what you think the most salient parallels are that we need to be thinking about for this current political moment. What do we need to be paying attention to? How do we respond to history repeating itself? And what are the ways in which we can resist most effectively, right? So that it's not just resisting through the Democratic Party, if you will, or other kind of centrist responses, which maintain these structures and which perpetuate these structures, but that really dismantle fascism and white nationalism and expansionism. If you can share any wisdom there.
Yeah, that's the big question that I think first, if we could just begin having conversations. I think there are a lot, I'm not saying there aren't a lot of conversations, I think there are, and I've been involved in many, but I think the history, you know, in the United States, we've now gone through, you know, periods of massive protests, massive workers' rights movements, women's movements, civil rights, anti-racist movement. We're in that moment right now with Black Lives Matter. And we don't pull out of that organizations that have a focus. They're often separated by definition, either class, race, or, you know, for Native people, which is kind of the odd man out because it doesn't fit in with those standards of having a land issue, land-based sovereignty, even possible independence, if you know, and liberation, which is related to settler colonialism. That hardly even gets into the generalized discussion at all, except sometimes adding on and Indigenous people's rights or whatever, without really understanding what that would mean for the whole United States to reconfigure the land, which I think is really the most important thing to try to undo settler colonialism means restoration of huge amounts of land to the appropriate Native nations. So that's not even in the discussion. And as things get more dire, there's a tendency to deal with that, you know, manifestation. But we've had this fascism always. It's built into the fiscal military state, which is a concept I deal with quite a bit in the book. A borrowed term. It means the capitalist state built for war, basically. And it was that from the very beginning. So the idea of progress based upon that is in itself, you know, problematic. And we're like a wheel going around that spins it, and a slightly different manifestation or convergence comes up, but the same underlying issues. So the fascism that's always existed, but had been kind of repressed, I knew it hadn't gone away because I come from rural Oklahoma and knew it was still alive and well there, and that it's one of about 20 states that is a very strong underlying, and now, I mean, just taken over. I mean, it has returned to power without any pretenses. And it's good that it's out in the open, but to think that to go back to what was is a solution, you know, it's, first of all, it's not going to happen. The cat is out of the bag. White nationalism is out of the bag. And now we have to deal with it. And I think that means that, the metropolitan left, which the left mostly is, has to do some self-education, you know, about the history of this country and understand that white nationalism is what it's based upon. It's not just some kind of mental illness that has suddenly appeared, or an evil that can be stamped out, or something that is a minor thing. The Trump presidency told us that it came to power, you know, and the presidency, and it's still looming there at a very high level. It's very prominent in the military, throughout the military ranks and police forces. So they're mostly armed and dangerous, either officially or unofficially armed and dangerous. So I'm still not fully on, I guess I can be seen in a little box, right? But I don't know exactly how to get back, but I think we're ready to start, Francesca. Is there any way you can get me back into a normal state here?
I see you.
Yeah, I see you as well. You should be okay. Don't stop, keep talking. I just stopped barking, that's all.
Okay.
Well, let me say thank you so much, Roxanne, for the ability to be in conversation with you. It's just always such a tremendous honor to hear you and to learn from you. But before I keep gushing, I know people have their questions. So let me just say thank you so much for the wisdom of your book and all just decades and decades of commitments to struggle and revolution that is so deeply inspiring. So thank you. I raise my hands to you. And I'm going to turn it over to Francesca now.
Well, let me say thank you, Harsha, so much. I'm such an admirer of yours and so honored that you came and had this conversation with me. And I also want to mention Harsha's book, Border Rule, that came out just a few months ago from Haymarket. It's an amazing book, and I think our two books should be read together. And you also have been doing some events, and people can look those up and see you presenting about it.
Thank you so much, Roxanne. It's such an honor. Thank you.
I agree. Thank you both so much for such thought-provoking conversation and for pointing out some of the ways in which our conversations, especially in liberal left or metro left, like you said, are still need to be deconstructed. So thank you so much for that. I will move into some of the questions that we have already and see how you feel with that, Ms. Dunbar-Ortiz, if that's okay with you. So let's go on with the first one. It says, who or what is your biggest inspiration as a writer?
Oh, that's a good question. You know, I read so much, it would probably, I have a very long list of greatly admired writers. But what I'm most, you know, I'm a historian, so sticking with historical work, of course, the great and wonderful Howard Zinn, who's no longer with us, but whose work is as important as ever. Another inspiration is a historian is Walter Johnson. Robin Kelly also has a new book he is gestating right now that I look forward to. Barbara Ransby. These are historians that I greatly admire. Jennifer Denetow, a Dene Navajo historian. Nick Estes, also great historian. So in the history field, I read a lot of fiction. I really love literary fiction. I don't like genre fiction that much, crime, romance. That I like literary fiction. And one of my very favorite fiction writers is Sigrid Nunez, N-U-N-E-Z, a child of immigrants, of German, as Sigrid, a German woman, and a Chinese Panamanian man, her father. And she tells that story in one of her novels, but I highly recommend Sigrid Nunez literary work.
Thank you for your recommendations. I'm pretty sure our listeners will be jotting them all down. Next, we have a question from Cyril. Can you please comment on the narrative that claims Indigenous peoples were the quote unquote first immigrants? How would you address human occupation of the North American continent for 40,000 plus years?
Yeah, and I think it was quite a few tens of thousands of years more than the 40,000 that's estimated. People lived lighter on the land then. This was in John F. Kennedy's Nation of Immigrants. He actually characterizes the Native Americans as the first immigrants. And he bases this upon a pernicious belief that came out of Ireland at some point. It's not the only one of this sort, but it's his that he talks about, that the people who were here when the Pilgrims came, when the British settlers came to Jamestown, that they were not the indigenous people, that these were tribes that had invaded and killed off the real Aborigines, as he calls them, the Aborigines, who may have been related to the Irish. So he has Irish immigration kind of going back to Ireland, which is weird. But it's not the only theory like that. It's a way of finding a way of disappearing people that colonialism tried to disappear and did not succeed. And it's a hopeless task because there's also always the Bering Strait theory of populating the Western Hemisphere. Is also a politicized, I call it politicized archaeology. There are a few Native archaeologists developing some, and I think it's going to change, but it's been just set in stone since the beginning of US anthropology, which was kind of a military created thing to go along with imperialism. So you don't trust it that much, but it's this insistence that that the entire Western Hemisphere to Tierra del Fuego came from the Northern Arctic. It's a theory of migration that it wouldn't exist anywhere else in the world. You have people crisscrossing, going in different places. And no, this was like a funnel that poured people in, and they went all the way to Tierra del Fuego and populated the Western Hemisphere. This would take tens of thousands of more years, than it did. And it's just not even feasible. So there were migrations back and forth on the Pacific, especially with South America. There were very likely back and forth in the Atlantic between India and Africa. And none of this has been studied simply because this, a cap has been literally, the Arctic cap has been put on it. This is how it happened. So this in itself, is a way of diminishing the global reality that existed before Western European imperialism.
Yeah, it's definitely a very complicated question that people have tried to answer in the past in different ways. But thank you for bringing that back and sharing with us your opinion. I have two more questions. Well, actually a couple. So, but we don't have time for all of them. So I'm going to ask this one, which I think is something that I was thinking myself, especially when I heard you and Harsha talking. It's, what do you think it'll take for disenfranchised peoples and allies to revolt against the system of white nationalism and or fascism as opposed to defer to subgroups revolting against different facets of white nationalism. That is racism, workers' rights, women's rights, etc. So how basically can we all work together like allies and disenfranchised people themselves to revolt against the white nationalism rhetoric?
Yes, we definitely need to build coalitions that could become, I've had this idea for a long time that we need to convene a parliament of organizations, you know, sort of a representation that could come to dialogue with each other and learn from each other, because we have a, you know, 350 million people in the United States, and it's a very complex history of genocide, slavery, racism, almost like no other country in the world. Certainly the fact that the United States is the most powerful and richest country in the world by far, by huge, and also owns the most guns by far. So it's a complicated place, and until we have all the pieces to put together, and some of us, you know, historians especially, try to do that, but we're individuals, you know, we're not deeply involved in most cases in activism that covers all those things. We can only do so much. I did international indigenous work for 30 years, helping build an international indigenous caucus in the United Nations. And other people, you know, the Black Lives Matter, they all are, you know, all of these things are extremely important, but we don't really have very good mechanisms, even with the internet and all. We still stay in our, you know, in our lane usually, because how much can a brain, you know, even hold at the same time, balance all these things? So I think if we had something like that, I call it a parliament, you know, but just because I like that idea that we would be, I got that idea from the European Parliament. I spent a summer in Strasbourg, France, where the European Parliament is located. And I was just so impressed, because these are just very ordinary people who are elected from their countries to go, and they're not really politicians per se. And they're mainly, they're often activists. Green Party was very prominent in 1983, the summer I was there studying international law at the university. So I think, you know, I think that's a really good concept that we could take, not to institutionalize it, you know, with the federal government, but maybe with the United Nations. You know, we could have that link to internationally.
It has to go beyond, right? It has to go beyond borders. It has to go beyond identities and stuff like that. So yeah, I agree with you. There's a lot of work to be done yet. And conversations like these, I think, are the ones that are going to get us to that work. So once again, thank you everybody for attending, and especially Harsha and you, Mrs. Dunbar-Ortiz, for presenting your research, your work, your ideas, and how, and helping us in the International House and in Seminary Co-op Bookstores bring these conversations to the table. Please check out the links that I have put in the chat, and thank you so much for joining, and we'll see you soon with new events. Have a good one.
Thank you. Thank everyone.